There's a special kind of pain that comes from being doubted by the person who raised you. Not anger, not shock, just that hollow ache of realizing love was never the same thing as respect. For years, I kept my head down, did everything right, hoping one day he'd look at me and see more than a disappointment. But in that courtroom, when my father rose from his seat, pointed straight at me, and told the judge, "She's lying, she never served," I felt something end. It wasn't our relationship. That had been dying for years. It was my silence. Because in that moment, I knew the daughter he thought he could break was gone, and the man who taught me about honor was about to learn what it really means. I never thought the first voice to accuse me would come from the man who taught me to speak. The courtroom in El Paso County felt colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that didn't come from the air conditioning, but from the people sitting too still, waiting for something cruel to happen. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of small-town curiosity. Every eye turned toward the front, where my father, Marvin Thompson, stood. Chin high, shoulders squared, like he was back in church about to deliver a truth he believed belonged to him. He pointed at me. His voice didn't shake. She never served a single day in the Air Force. She faked it. Each word hit with the precision of a hammer. The attorney beside him, once a family friend who used to eat at our kitchen table, nodded like he'd just heard scripture. The judge glanced down at the file before him. Expression unreadable. I didn't move. My hands stayed clasped around the silver ring engraved with two small wings, the same one I'd worn for years as a reminder of something simple and clean. Purpose. The edges of it pressed into my palm, grounding me, keeping me upright. He said more. Said I had built a lie, lived off it, turned my mother's death into a profit. My daughter lied about serving this country. That was the moment everything inside me went quiet. Not numb, just quiet, like sound had retreated to a far corner of the room, leaving me alone with the echo of my own pulse. People began to murmur, the low hum of strangers feeding on scandal. I looked at him and searched for a flicker of recognition, a trace of the man who once showed me how to hold a wrench steady, who lifted me onto his shoulders to watch air shows over Peterson Air Force Base. But all I saw was a stranger in a suit too tight around his neck, his jaw locked in pride or pain. Maybe both. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Thompson, do you wish to respond?" I felt every word that wanted to come out, years of quiet endurance pressing against the back of my teeth. But I knew if I opened my mouth, it wouldn't be reason that came out. It would be everything else. Not today, Your Honor. He gave a single nod. The sound of his gavel followed, sharp, final, echoing off the walls like a small explosion. Session adjourned. The room began to empty, feet shuffling, whispers rising. I stayed seated. The ring dug deeper into my skin. On the table in front of me lay my veteran's ID card, slightly bent from years of being tucked in a wallet I rarely opened anymore. The fluorescent light above flickered, bouncing dull reflections off the laminate. Somewhere between the judge's gavel and the creak of the last door closing, I realized something had shifted. Not in him. In me. For so long I'd told myself there was still a bridge between us. Fragile. Maybe. But standing. That underneath his disappointment and his silence, there was love buried deep enough to outlast the damage. But when he said those words in front of everyone, he didn't just burn the bridge. He turned and watched it fall. I sat there until the clerk started stacking papers into neat piles, her heels clicking across the floor. The sound reminded me of a metronome, marking time between what used to be and what would come next. Outside the windows, the sky over Colorado was a dull gray. A single beam of sunlight cut through and landed on the metal emblem of my ring. For a second it glowed. And I thought of all the times I'd clung to faith in him, faith that if I just stayed quiet, stayed patient, he'd eventually see me for who I was. Now I saw what that patience had cost. When the bailiff called my name, I stood, smoothed my jacket, and forced my legs to move. The sound of my boots against the tile was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. As I reached the doorway, I turned once more. My father was still there, packing his papers with the attorney, not looking at me, not even by accident. I waited for him to glance up. He didn't. That was the moment the weight of years settled. All the small cuts of his disapproval, the quiet dismissals, the way he'd never asked how I'd survived the things I had, each one adding up until now, when he finally turned those private doubts into public accusation. The air in the courtroom still smelled of dust and old varnish. Somewhere above me, the ceiling fan turned slow, stirring the same stale air I'd been breathing since childhood. How did we get here? The thought came unbidden, rising like a whisper I couldn't silence. No answer. Only the echo of that question stretching out in my mind. I walked outside into the thin mountain air, the chill biting harder than I remembered. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the pull to explain myself, to fix it, to make him understand. I'd spent too long believing silence was the way to survive him. But now I knew silence was what built the cage, and I was done being small enough to fit inside it. What he didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that the truth he tried to bury had already begun to stir. And when it rose, it wouldn't ask for permission. I grew up in the shadow of the Rockies, where winters lingered too long, and the sound of jet engines from Peterson Air Force Base was the closest thing we had to a heartbeat. The town smelled of oil and iron, men in heavy jackets, and women who worked twice as hard, just to be heard half as much. My father belonged to that rhythm. He was a mechanic for the National Guard's vehicle unit, a man who trusted metal more than people, order more than emotion. His hands were always blackened with grease, his knuckles cracked and scarred, his silence mistaken for strength. He believed the world ran on rules, and men were the ones meant to enforce them. My mother, Diane, didn't fit his mold. She worked as a librarian at the community college, small, soft-voiced, and endlessly patient, where he worshipped bolts and torque wrenches. She loved words. She'd slip books into my hands when he wasn't looking. Books about spaceflight, aerodynamics, the history of flight. "You don't have to be built like your father to belong in the sky," she'd whisper. Most afternoons, I'd sneak into the garage while he was working, pretending to fetch him tools just so I could be near the smell of jet fuel and steel. I'd trace my fingers over the open guts of an engine he was rebuilding, fascinated by the way it all connected. He'd glance up, wipe his hands on a rag, and smirk. "You'll break your nails, not fix the world." I didn't answer. I learned early that silence made him more uncomfortable than defiance. But those 5 words, half insult, half prophecy, lit something in me. At 19, I enlisted, not out of rebellion, not even out of patriotism. It was the only language I had left to prove him wrong. The day I left, I stood on the porch with my duffel bag, waiting for him to come out, to say something. Anything. He never did. The door stayed closed. Mom drove me to the bus station. She wore her Sunday sweater, her face pale but proud. When the drill sergeants called our names one by one, I turned back and saw her holding a small bouquet. Carnations, half wilted, bought from the gas station on the way there. She waved it like it was a flag. I waved back and swallowed the lump in my throat. Boot camp stripped everything from me. Comfort, sleep, excuses. I was one of 3 women in my unit. The air smelled of sweat and diesel, and every command was barked as if the volume itself could measure my worth. But I learned quickly. Learned how to move faster, speak less, listen more. How to take up space without apologizing for it. When they sent me to radar operations, I found my rhythm, the hum of machines, the hiss of static, the voice on the other end of the comms. That was my world. Numbers, coordinates, flight paths. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. You learned to trust your instruments more than your instincts. Then came Guam. A Category 5 typhoon tore through the island like a monster with no name. The runways flooded. Comms went down. Aircraft were scattered in the sky, searching for somewhere to land. The power flickered, then died completely, and we switched to backup generators. For 18 straight hours, I manned the console, soaked in sweat and fear, guiding cargo planes toward strips of concrete that were barely holding together. Every voice on that frequency sounded the same: desperate, breaking, human. And I kept talking, calm, precise. Echo 7, maintain heading. Echo 7, you're clear to descend. By dawn, 24 people were alive who shouldn't have been. When the storm cleared, the commanding officer called me into his tent. He handed me a handwritten note and a commendation. Outstanding composure under critical conditions. Then he said, almost casually, you've earned your call sign, Echo 7. It wasn't a medal, but to me, it was everything. Months later, when my tour ended, I flew home with that note folded in my pocket and the feeling, foolish, maybe, that my father would finally see me as more than a girl playing with tools. The drive from the airport felt endless. The sky above Colorado was sharp and blue, the mountains still dusted with snow. When I walked into the house, he was in the garage, just like always, elbows deep in an engine block. I stood there a moment before setting the small silver pin, the one that bore my call sign, on the workbench beside him. He looked at it, then at me. You fixed planes, not people, he said flatly. Don't call yourself a veteran. I remember laughing, but it wasn't humor, it was disbelief. I'd spent years chasing his approval, and he dismantled it in a single breath. Like another broken part he didn't have the patience to repair. I picked up the pin, slipped it back into my pocket, and told myself I didn't care. But the truth is, I did. Every word he said that day lived under my skin. In that moment, something small and sacred inside me began to fracture. Because in his world, service only counted if you came home bloodied. If you hadn't fought on the front lines, you hadn't fought at all. And in his mind, women didn't belong anywhere near the fight. I carried his words with me like shrapnel, not visible, not fatal, just deep enough to remind me every day that no matter how hard I tried, he'd never see me as enough. I didn't know it then, but that mission, Echo 7, was classified. It wouldn't appear on any public record. The commendation letter, the logs, the tapes, all sealed away under Department of Defense clearance, which meant one day, when someone tried to erase me, they'd find the perfect opening, and my father, the man who once said he believed in honor above all else, would be the first to take it. 8 years of service ended with a handshake, a folded flag, and a certificate that said honorable discharge. It was supposed to mean I'd done enough, that I could come home and build something steady. I found a small apartment near Colorado Springs and started teaching aircraft maintenance at the community college. My students were mostly kids who'd grown up around engines the way I had. Sons of mechanics, daughters of airmen, all chasing a version of flight they could touch with their hands. Life was quiet, predictable. I learned how to fill silence with work, how to smile just enough to pass for content. For a while, I believed that was enough. Until the phone call that shattered it. Mom was gone. Lung cancer. It didn't feel real until I saw the snow. The day of the funeral. Colorado was covered in white, a kind of cruel purity that made everything look untouched, even grief. People from the library came, neighbors too, but all I could see was her chair by the casket, empty. My father didn't speak the entire service. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, jaw locked, staring straight ahead. When the pastor invited us to say something, I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd tell a story. One of those small ones only a husband could. He didn't. When it was my turn, I could barely manage a sentence. She taught me how to read the sky, I said, and then stopped, because my voice broke. After the burial, everyone went back to their cars. He didn't look at me, didn't even nod. The silence that had always lived between us now felt permanent, like cement drying around everything we'd never said. Weeks passed in a blur of paperwork. One afternoon, the family lawyer called me into his office. The heater buzzed weakly against the winter chill as he handed me the will. Mom had left the house and a modest savings account. My name was on both. She'd opened that account years earlier when I first joined the service. Every month, I sent money home for her treatments, and every month she refused to spend a cent until she was gone. I didn't know whether to cry or curse her for saving it. A few days later, a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs arrived in my mailbox. Caregiver benefit approval. A small stipend granted to service members who had cared for a terminally ill family member. It wasn't much, but it felt like acknowledgement, the kind that didn't come from medals or applause. That evening, I placed the letter on the kitchen table. The paper was still crisp, the ink sharp. I left it there for my father to read when he stopped by. I thought maybe he'd be proud that something I'd done, something from my years of service, had helped take care of Mom. He came over an hour later, boots tracking snow onto the tile. I told him about the VA letter, about what it meant. He listened in silence, jaw tightening, eyes scanning the page. Then he slammed his hand on the table, grabbed the letter, and threw it onto the floor. "So that's what you do now?" he said, his voice rough. "Use your service to collect checks from your dead mother?" The words hit harder than any command I'd ever taken. I bent down, picked up the paper. It was torn slightly at the edge, a corner smudged with grease from his hand. I tried to speak, to explain, but my throat closed around the words. He walked out without looking back. The front door slammed, and the sound echoed through the kitchen like a verdict. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch, the letter in my lap, the snow outside glowing under the porch light. The world was still, but I could feel something moving under my ribs, a slow burn, the beginning of something I couldn't name yet. A month later, an envelope from the El Paso County Courthouse arrived. It was thin, almost weightless. I tore it open, not expecting anything more than another legal form about Mom's estate. It wasn't. Inside was a notice of suit. My father had filed a claim, fraudulent representation of veteran status for personal financial gain. I stared at the words until they blurred. Beneath the typed accusations, a small section listed the complainant contact information. There it was. Marvin, Thompson Springs Auto, Biz. For a long time, I just sat there, the paper trembling between my fingers. The radiator clicked softly behind me, and somewhere in the distance, a snowplow scraped the road. The world went on, unaware that mine had just collapsed. It wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about proof, about control, about the version of me he needed to exist in order for him to stay whole. I tried to tell myself it couldn't be him, that maybe someone else had pushed him into it. But I knew better. I'd seen that look before. The same one from years ago when I showed him the pin from the Air Force, when he'd told me not to call myself a veteran. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it on the counter. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night, I found the old family Bible on the shelf, the one Mom used to keep tucked under her apron drawer. She had scribbled notes inside, recipes, reminders, bits of hope. On one of the back pages, in her looping handwriting, I found a line I'd never noticed before. Be kind, even when it costs you. I closed the book, pressed it against my chest, and realized how much that kindness had cost her. How much it was costing me now. I thought of my father sitting somewhere across town, probably at the same kitchen table, the same silence between us, convincing himself he was right, that he was protecting her memory, or punishing me for something he couldn't forgive himself for. I wanted to hate him, I really did, but hate requires space, and I didn't have any left. All I had was disbelief that a man could tear down his own blood just to keep his pride standing. I went to the window, looked out at the snow still falling under the streetlight, and whispered to no one, "You've already taken enough. Dad, don't take this too." But deep down, I knew he already had. And what neither of us realized yet was that this, that single act of betrayal, would be the thing that changed everything. It wasn't the disease that killed my mother that broke our family apart. It was the silence that followed her, the kind that waits years for its turn to destroy something else. I thought I had learned to live with doubt. It was something I'd carried since childhood, quiet, invisible, like background noise. But nothing prepares you for the kind of silence that comes from a system erasing your life one line at a time. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a glitch. On the VA portal, under Service Record, my screen blinked twice before settling on a short, sterile summary. Service history, 2005, 2012. No active deployment confirmed. I scrolled down, again and again, expecting something to load, a missing file, a hidden tab, anything. But the 2 years that mattered most, the years I'd served under the call sign Echo 7, were gone. I refreshed the page until the cursor stopped blinking, as if the database itself had decided my service didn't exist. My heart pounded, slow and heavy, like something was falling apart inside me, and I was just waiting to hear the sound. The next morning, I drove to the VA office in downtown Colorado Springs. The waiting area smelled of burnt coffee and recycled air, the walls lined with faded posters about veteran benefits. When my number was called, I sat across from a middle-aged clerk with tired eyes. She typed quickly, then frowned. "Someone requested a verification audit on your file last month," she said, turning the monitor slightly toward me. The request came from this address. The fax number printed on the paper was familiar. I stared at it, trying to make the letters make sense. Marvin, Thompson, Springs Auto, Biz. For a second, my brain refused to connect the dots. Then it did. My father's garage. His name. His email. The clerk said something else, but I didn't hear it. I nodded, took the copy she printed, and walked out into the parking lot where the wind cut through my jacket. My hands were shaking, the paper trembling in them like it already knew what I didn't want to admit. That evening, I drove back to the old wooden house I'd grown up in. The garage light was still on, same as it always had been, that soft yellow glow against the dark. He was there, wiping his hands on a rag, bent over an engine block. For a moment, I stood in the doorway, just watching. "You did this?" I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't look up. I asked for the truth. He said, "If you served, prove it." I felt something twist inside me. Not anger yet, just disbelief. "You were supposed to believe in me. Belief doesn't fix lies." The words landed heavier than the sound they made. He said it like it was nothing, like we were arguing about a tool he couldn't find. His eyes stayed on the machine, his hands steady, his face calm. It was as if I wasn't even in the room. I stared at him for a long time, waiting for him to flinch, to show some sign that this hurt him too. He didn't. The hum of the overhead light filled the silence. When I finally turned to leave, he still hadn't looked up. Driving back through the empty streets, I watched his silhouette shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. The snow had started again, light and fine, the kind that looks harmless until it covers everything. At home, I pulled out the metal storage box I kept tucked under my bed, my own version of a time capsule. Inside were pieces of a life that no longer seemed to count, a few blurred photos in uniform, a folded commendation letter, and a note written in my commander's tight script, E7 cleared for secondary operations, maintain classified chain. It wasn't much. Not legally, not officially, but it was mine. Proof that the things I remembered actually happened, that I hadn't imagined the noise, the fear, the hours spent in the storm saving people I'd never meet. I sat on the floor, the cold from the tiles seeping through my jeans, holding that paper like it could anchor me. My father once told me, when I was little and learning to fix the carburetor on his truck, a system only works when every bolt is tightened right. One loose piece, and it all comes down. He'd said it as a lesson, a warning about attention to detail. But now, sitting there with his name printed on the fax that stripped me of my record, I understood what he really meant. He hadn't just loosened a bolt. He'd pulled it clean out. It wasn't enough for him to question my service. He needed to dismantle it, to take apart every piece of who I'd become until nothing was left that could threaten his version of himself. Because if my service was real, then so was his failure. I leaned back against the wall, the paper still in my hands. The silence in the apartment pressed heavy against me. I tried to breathe, to think about what to do next, but all I could hear was the echo of his voice. Belief doesn't fix lies. For years, I had tried to earn his faith. Now, I realized he never had any to give. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the window frame. I stared at the faint reflection of myself in the glass, the tired eyes, the stubborn jaw, and wondered when I had started to look more like him. I told myself not to cry, that I'd lived through worse storms than this, that a piece of missing paperwork couldn't undo what I'd done. But it wasn't the missing record that broke me. It was the knowing that the person who should have defended me had chosen to erase me instead. By the time I turned off the light and crawled into bed, I knew sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept circling back to one truth, one I couldn't shake. He didn't need proof that I'd lied. He needed proof that I'd failed. And the cruelest part was knowing he'd finally gotten it, not because I was guilty, but because he'd decided I was. The same man who taught me how to steady my hands while fixing a loose bolt had just dismantled the last thing holding us together. The courtroom smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish. Every sound carried too far, the creak of benches, the shuffle of shoes, the scratch of a pen. I'd been in places quieter than this, but never one where silence felt so pointed. It was the first hearing. My father sat only a few feet away, not once looking in my direction. The attorney beside him, the same man who'd toasted my acceptance into the Air Force all those years ago, now flipped through his notes with surgical calm. When he stood, his voice was smooth, confident, practiced. "Your Honor," he said, presenting a folder of documents. "My client's daughter claims to have served, but the official record shows no active deployment. She fabricated a commendation letter to support a false claim of service." The words hung in the air like smoke. The gallery murmured. A few people leaned forward. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I rose slowly, my voice steadier than my heart. "I can't present the deployment logs. They're sealed under Department of Defense classification." For a moment, the judge just looked at me, his brow furrowed. My father gave a small, humorless laugh, barely audible, but sharp enough to slice through the quiet. "How convenient," he muttered. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles burned. Every instinct screamed at me to shout, to tell them what that mission cost, to remind him that I'd spent 18 sleepless hours keeping men alive in a typhoon while he was home changing spark plugs. But the courtroom wasn't a place for emotion. It was a place for proof. And mine was locked behind a wall of secrecy. My attorney requested a delay, a chance to call a witness, Colonel Marcus Avery, my former commanding officer. The judge approved the motion. The next hearing was set for 2 weeks later. When I'd left the Air Force, Avery had shaken my hand and said, "If you ever need me, I'll show up." It was a simple promise, and I'd believed him. But the subpoena we sent was returned unsigned. No forwarding address, no message, nothing. The night before the next hearing, I barely slept. I dreamed of static, the kind that hums through a radio before a voice cuts through. "Echo 7, do you copy?" I heard myself answer, calm and automatic, "Copy that." Then came his voice, steady, commanding, a memory more than a sound. "Hold your line." I woke up with my heart racing and rain tapping hard against the window. The storm outside mirrored the one in my chest. I turned on the lamp. On the desk beside it sat my Air Force pin, the small silver wings dulled with age. I ran my thumb over it, and for the first time in a long time, it felt heavy, cold. By morning, the rain hadn't stopped. The courthouse steps were slick, the kind of gray morning that made everything look blurred at the edges. Inside, the same faces waited, the judge, the lawyers, the same gallery of strangers who'd come to witness a family tear itself apart. The back row was empty. No Colonel Avery, no letter, no miracle. When the judge called the session to order, I already knew how this would go. The lawyer for my father laid out his arguments with the confidence of a man who had already won. He moved through each piece of paper like he was conducting an orchestra, accusation after accusation, polished and rehearsed. He ended with a quiet, measured line. "The burden of proof lies with the defendant." The judge nodded. "Ms. Thompson." You'll have 48 hours to submit any further evidence or witness testimony. After that, we'll move to summary judgment. I wanted to tell them that some things couldn't be proved on paper, that honor wasn't something you filed or notarized, but instead, I just nodded. My attorney's hand brushed mine, a silent reminder to stay composed. When it was over, I gathered my documents and walked out, ignoring the curious stares from the gallery. My father was still seated when I passed him, head lowered as he shuffled papers into a neat pile. I waited for him to look up, but he didn't. Outside, the rain hit harder. It soaked through my coat before I reached the bottom of the courthouse steps. The cold bit into my skin, but I kept walking, each step echoing off the stone like a small defiance. Somewhere behind me, a door opened. "Ms. Thompson!" The voice was faint, almost lost to the rain. I turned, heart leaping, expecting, hoping to see him. Colonel Avery, maybe. Arriving too late, but still arriving. But there was only a man in a dark coat at the far end of the corridor, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He paused as if deciding whether to come closer, then turned and disappeared down the hallway. I waited there for a long moment, staring after him until the doors swung shut again. Then I walked to my car, water dripping from my hair, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally sat inside, the sound of the rain against the windshield grew louder, drowning out everything else. I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel and let the quiet settle in. There are moments when even grief feels too big for tears. This was one of them. Somewhere out there, my record was gone. My witness had vanished. My father had turned me into an enemy, and the only person left to stand up for me was me. Still, as the wipers swept back and forth, I caught myself whispering into the empty car, the same words I'd once spoken into static. "Hold your line." The storm outside didn't let up. Neither did I. 2 weeks later, the final hearing began. The courtroom was overflowing, every bench filled, every corner lined with curious faces. I could feel the hum of anticipation before a word was spoken. Reporters waited with their cameras poised. The small-town rumor mill had already turned my life into a spectacle. The headline might as well have written itself, "Local woman accused by her own father of stolen valor." I'd chosen to wear my old uniform. The blue fabric had faded, the creases softer from years folded away, but I pressed it until every seam was straight. The silver Air Force pin gleamed under the courthouse lights. I didn't wear the medals. I didn't need to. I hadn't come to prove I was heroic, only honest. When the bailiff called the session to order, Judge Harper struck his gavel once. "Let's proceed," he said, and the air seemed to tighten. My father's attorney rose. His tone was calm, confident, the kind of practiced composure that made the truth sound like a performance. "Your Honor, the defense still has not provided verifiable proof of active deployment. The burden of proof lies entirely with Ms. Thompson." I stood, handed over my documents, my military ID, my training evaluations, my honorable discharge papers. He flipped through them with a faint smirk, as though the outcome had already been written. "Still nothing verifying deployment," he said, closing the folder with a soft snap. My father sat in the front row, arms crossed, his expression blank but his posture rigid. I looked at him, not with anger this time, but with the quiet ache that comes from finally seeing someone exactly as they are. "Dad," I asked softly, "do you really believe I'd lie about serving?" He met my eyes for the first time all morning. "I believe what I see, and I don't see proof." The words landed harder than any accusation. The room was still enough to hear the faint roll of a pen falling off a desk and hitting the floor. Even that small sound seemed to echo. Judge Harper's gaze moved from me to the clerk. "If there are no additional witnesses..." The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A man's voice broke through, deep and steady. "Your Honor, permission to speak as an expert witness." Every head turned. A tall figure stepped forward from the crowd, broad shoulders, hair silvered at the temples, the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd spent decades in uniform. He carried a leather briefcase and a quiet authority that made the whispers die on their own. The judge raised a brow. "Colonel, you weren't listed as a witness." The man approached the stand, producing an ID card from his jacket. "Colonel Marcus Avery, United States Air Force, retired." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. I hadn't seen him in years, not since Guam, not since the night we'd saved those aircraft from the storm. "No, sir," he continued. "I wasn't listed, but I bring evidence the court has not seen." My father stood abruptly. "This is absurd! He has no right." Judge Harper's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Thompson, sit down, or I'll have you removed." The energy in the room shifted. Doubt gave way to tension, and tension to a sharp, almost tangible hope. Colonel Avery opened his briefcase and drew out a thick folder bound with a red cover. Stamped with a single bold heading, "Classified Release, Pacific Haven." He laid it carefully on the judge's bench. Sergeant Briella Thompson, call sign Echo 7, was deployed under Operation Pacific Haven, a humanitarian relief mission classified under Department of Defense protection until this year. For a second, I couldn't move. My mind replayed the storm, the frantic radio calls, the faces I never forgot. It all came rushing back. The 18 hours that had defined me, now reduced to a single document no one had been allowed to see until now. The gallery erupted in whispers. My father's attorney scrambled to recover, his voice higher than before. "We need verification of authenticity." Colonel Avery nodded once, unfazed. "Here is the signed commendation letter, original copy, and a handwritten note from the mission commander confirming her actions." He placed both on the table before the judge. The paper rustled like thunder in the silence. Judge Harper studied the documents carefully, eyes narrowing as he read. When he looked up again, the doubt in his face was gone. But Avery wasn't finished. He reached once more into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with time, its edges soft from years of keeping. He held it up. "And one more item," he said quietly. "This letter was sent to me by Mrs. Diane Thompson, her mother, after the mission, thanking our unit for keeping her daughter safe." A wave of stillness swept through the courtroom. I recognized the handwriting instantly, small, looping, steady, my mother's. My father's face drained of color. He pushed halfway out of his seat, his voice cracking. "That letter, enough! Mr. Thompson," the judge warned, "one more outburst, and you'll be escorted out." Colonel Avery folded the letter carefully and set it in front of me. His eyes softened. "She earned her place, Your Honor." The records and her mother's words both confirm that. I couldn't speak. The paper trembled in my hands. My mother had written that letter more than a decade ago, and somehow it had survived, waiting quietly in a drawer of classified files until today. For a long moment, Judge Harper said nothing. Then he leaned back, exhaled, and brought down his gavel. "This court recognizes Ms. Thompson's service as valid and honorable. Case dismissed. No applause, no sound at all, just the hollow stillness of truth settling into the room. Across from me, my father lowered his head. The man who once taught me what honor meant now sat motionless, hands trembling against his knees. I'd thought I would feel triumph in this moment, vindication, but all I felt was a strange, aching quiet. The reporters lowered their cameras. The townspeople whispered among themselves. I just stood there, staring at the sunlight cutting through the high windows, landing directly on the Air Force pin over my heart. It shimmered faintly in the light, a small drapeau, steady proof that everything he tried to erase had survived. And for the first time since this began, I understood what winning really felt like. Not joy, not relief, just the simple, heavy calm that comes when a wound stops bleeding but hasn't yet healed. After the gavel fell and the courtroom began to empty, I stayed still for a long time. People filed past, their voices hushed, like they'd witnessed something too fragile to disturb. Eventually, the clerk announced a 30-minute recess to archive the files. I stepped out into the hallway, grateful for the quiet. The corridor stretched ahead under flickering fluorescent lights. Each step echoed faintly against the tile, a strange rhythm between exhaustion and disbelief. I could still feel the weight of the verdict in my chest, like a heartbeat that refused to calm down. Colonel Avery was waiting near the exit, hands clasped behind his back, the same way he used to stand during briefings. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him without the uniform. He gave me a small smile when our eyes met. "You didn't have to come," I said softly. "I did," he answered, and the steadiness in his voice anchored me. "Your mother's letter reached me right before I retired. She asked me to keep it, said someday you might need it." My throat tightened. I bit down on my lip to keep from crying. "I thought you'd forgotten me." He shook his head. "No one forgets Echo 7. Something in the way he said it broke whatever wall I'd built around myself. For years, I'd carried my service alone, unsure if it even counted. To hear him say it like a fact, like my name still meant something, made it real again." He rested a hand on my shoulder, his grip steady and warm. "Your father," he said quietly, "he's not your enemy. He's just a man who never forgave himself." I swallowed hard. "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" He looked at me with a gentleness that didn't need words. "He doesn't need to. You've already forgiven him by showing up." That was it. The moment I felt something shift inside me. Not release, not relief, just understanding. For the first time in months, I wasn't angry. I was simply tired and free. When I walked out into the sunlight, a crowd had gathered at the courthouse steps. Reporters pushed microphones toward me, shouting questions that all sounded the same. "Ms. Thompson, how does it feel to be vindicated?" I paused, the noise blurring into one long hum. "It's not about vindication," I said finally. "It's about remembering what we serve for." Flashbulbs went off, blinding for a second. I turned away. Across the street, I saw my father. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed somewhere on the ground, his shoulders slightly hunched, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. The man who once stood taller than anyone I knew suddenly seemed smaller, quieter, older. I wanted to call out, to bridge the space between us, but my throat closed. He didn't look up, and I didn't move. We just stood there, separated by a single stretch of road and years of misunderstanding. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away. I watched him disappear into the afternoon crowd, his figure blending into the motion of strangers. We were heading in opposite directions now, but for the first time, I knew we were both carrying the same thing, the letter that had outlived everything else, her words, her faith, her love strong enough to outlast silence, and that, somehow, was enough. The rain started as a whisper, the kind that barely leaves a mark on your coat until you realize you're soaked. I stepped out of the courthouse into the early March chill, the wind from the Rockies cutting across the steps like a warning. Behind me, voices rose, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, a dozen strangers trying to capture a story they would never really understand. Their words blurred into static. All I could hear was my heartbeat, slow, steady, foreign in its calm. The case was over. The truth had spoken for itself. Justice, people would say, vindication, closure, but none of those words felt real. Honor, once restored, felt heavier than I remembered, like a stone I'd been forced to carry uphill, only to realize the weight didn't lift when I reached the top. I found myself walking without direction until I ended up at the small coffee shop my mother used to love. It still smelled of pine wood and cinnamon, the same chipped mugs lined along the back shelf. I sat at her favorite table, the one by the window where the light hit soft in the mornings. The waitress brought me a cup I didn't ask for. I let it sit untouched, steam curling away into the air. Outside, the rain traced thin rivers down the glass, blurring the world into shapes and colors. In the reflection, I saw a woman who had just won her case, but the face staring back didn't look victorious. I thought about my father, how he'd sat through the verdict, rigid, silent, unflinching, As if staying still might keep his pride from collapsing, he never looked at me once. And suddenly I remembered another day, years ago, standing with him at the county air show. I couldn't have been more than 12. He'd pointed up at the sky, at a formation of jets carving white trails through the blue, and said, "See that? That's what real service looks like." Back then, I thought I understood what he meant. Now, I wasn't so sure, because I had been there, inside that sky. I'd lived in the roar and the radio silence, in the space between fear and duty. I had served, and somehow, it still wasn't real enough for him. My phone buzzed against the table. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "It's Dean." My brother's voice trembled, and even before he said the words, I knew. Dad's not well. His heart's acting up again. He hasn't said a word since the trial. I pressed my thumb to the edge of the cup, watching the ripples in the dark coffee stilling. The sound of the rain filled the silence between us. "He keeps staring at Mom's picture," Dean added quietly. "Maybe you should come." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't anger anymore that filled me. It was something colder, heavier, shaped like grief, but not quite the same. "All right," I said finally. "I'll come." When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, my hand still holding the phone. I watched the traffic lights reflect off the wet pavement, red and white streaks cutting through the gray. On the table beside me, my Air Force pin caught the glow from a passing car. The metal sparkled for a brief second, bright, sharp, almost beautiful, then faded back into shadow. That light felt like the truth itself. Fleeting, hard-won, but too cold to warm you once it's yours. I left the coffee untouched. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking toward my car, the sound of my boots echoing against the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low against the mountains. Justice had been served, yes, but justice had nothing to say about love. And as I drove into the gray horizon, the road winding toward the house I swore I'd never go back to, I realized something I hadn't dared admit until then. Sometimes, victory doesn't bring silence because it's peaceful. It brings silence because there's nothing left to say. By the time I reached his house, the rain had stopped. The night air carried that cold, clean smell that always comes after a storm. Like the world had been rinsed but not renewed. The porch light was still on, flickering weakly, throwing pale shadows across the familiar front steps. I stood there for a moment, hand hovering over the door, before pushing it open. Inside, the air was thick with quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, just heavy. I could hear the soft tick of the clock on the wall, every second stretching a little too long. My father sat in his worn armchair, facing the dark television screen. The light from a single lamp caught the silver in his hair, but his eyes looked somewhere else entirely. Next to him, on the coffee table, an old file box sat open, papers spilling out like ghosts. He didn't look up when I stepped inside. For a while, I didn't speak either. I just watched the rise and fall of his shoulders, the faint tremor in his hand resting on the armrest. When he finally spoke, his voice came rough, almost breaking with each word. "I didn't lie to hurt you," he said. "I just couldn't take it." "Take what?" I asked quietly. He exhaled, the sound more like defeat than breath. "When I was your age, I applied to the Air Force Technical School, failed. My father served, my brother served, and I. Fixed cars. The admission hung in the air, brittle and bare. I felt my throat tighten, the pieces starting to fit together in a way that made cruel sense. "So you punished me for doing what you couldn't." He didn't look at me, just stared ahead, eyes glistening under the lamplight. "I told myself you didn't serve, because if you did, it meant I was a coward." Silence followed, long enough to make the old house creak. The wind pressed against the windows, but even that sound felt careful, afraid to interrupt. "You hurt me, Dad," I said finally. my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. But I get it now. You weren't trying to erase me. You were trying to erase your failure. For the first time, his eyes met mine, red, wet, unguarded. I'd spent years wanting him to look at me that way, and now that he did, it broke something open inside me. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw working against the weight of regret. I see you now, he said softly. And I'm sorry. He reached for the file box beside him, pulling out a photograph. The edges were frayed, the colors faded. It was from my Air Force graduation, me in uniform, my mother beside me, her smile bright enough to outshine the desert sun. Beneath the photo was an old envelope, yellowed and thin, my mother's handwriting looping across the front. For my daughter, when she needs to remember who she is. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The paper was fragile, like her voice might crumble if I wasn't gentle enough. If someday your service is questioned, remember, honor doesn't need witnesses. It just needs truth. If he doubts you, it's his fear speaking, not his heart. By the time I reached the end, the ink had blurred where my tears fell. She wrote that after you left, he said quietly. I found it after she passed, but couldn't bring myself to read it. I folded the letter back along its old creases, then reached across the small space between us. His hand was cold, the skin rough, familiar in a way that ached. I took it anyway. Then let's read it together this time, I said. He nodded, his grip tightening just slightly. The clock ticked on, steady and slow, as the lamp cast a soft golden glow over us. The room smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish, but it felt different now, lighter somehow. 2 hands, one that had condemned, one that had resisted, rested together over a single piece of paper that had survived both war and silence. For years, the truth between us had been buried under pride, anger, and the noise of everything unsaid. But in that quiet moment, I understood something my mother must have known all along. Forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken out loud to exist. It just needs 2 people willing to stay in the same room long enough to find it. The wind outside eased, brushing softly against the house as if to signal its approval. I looked at the letter again, at her words, simple, certain, unshakable, and realized she hadn't written it for me alone. It was for him, too. For both of us. A confession for a daughter who doubted her worth, and a mercy for a man who never forgave himself. For the first time in years, the silence between us wasn't something to escape. It was something to keep. Spring came slowly to Colorado that year. By the time the snow melted from the peaks of Pikes Peak, the air smelled faintly of thawing pine and engine oil from the small hangars near the community college. Life had settled into something steady again, quiet, but no longer empty. When I returned to work, the first morning of the new semester felt different. The classroom buzzed with low conversation and the scrape of chairs. Most of my students were veterans, young, sharp-eyed men and women who carried their own scars beneath their sleeves. You could see it in the way they sat, back straight, hands still, always ready for something to go wrong. I set my books on the desk and then carefully placed a small wooden frame beside them. Inside it was the silver pin I'd once worn into battle. Echo 7, now polished and encased under glass. My father had built the frame himself. The corners weren't perfect, but the craftsmanship was steady. Sure, when I'd first found it on my doorstep a few weeks earlier, there'd been no note attached. He didn't need one. I understood what it meant. Some apologies don't come in words. They come in the quiet act of putting something broken back where it belongs. The students settled as I began. The morning light spilled through the tall windows, cutting lines of gold across the metal desks. Outside, the faint hum of aircraft engines rose and fell, a sound I'd never stopped loving. Today, I told them, we're talking about responsibility. Not the kind printed in manuals, but the kind that lives in your hands. You may never see the pilots you save, but their lives depend on your precision. A few of them nodded, scribbling notes. From the back row, I noticed movement. My father had slipped in, quiet as always. He wore his old blue shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows. When the class stood automatically to acknowledge him, he gave a small nod and took a seat in the last row. For a moment, I forgot what I was saying. The light coming through the window landed directly on him, soft and forgiving. He looked smaller somehow, less certain, but freer. I cleared my throat and continued. Halfway through the lesson, one of the younger students raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's Echo 7? Why that name?" I glanced down at the framed pin, at the way it caught the sunlight, and smiled. Because echoes last longer than noise. The class went quiet for a beat, the kind of silence that means someone's really listening. Then, from the back, a sound broke through, one pair of hands clapping. My father. He stood as he did it, his eyes shining with something that looked a lot like pride. The rest of the class followed, filling the room with applause that felt less like celebration and more like acknowledgement. I didn't speak. I just nodded once and smiled. After class, the students drifted out one by one until it was just the two of us. He waited by the door, hands in his pockets, that familiar uncertainty softening his shoulders. We stepped outside together into the crisp spring air. The wind carried the scent of jet fuel from the nearby airstrip, mixing with the sweetness of new leaves. "Your mom would have been proud," he said quietly. I met his eyes, the ache in my chest warm now instead of sharp. "She still is," I answered. He nodded, his rough, work-worn hand resting on my shoulder. The gesture was simple, but it held the weight of every apology he'd never spoken. We stood there for a while, neither of us needing to fill the silence. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and somewhere above, a plane cut across the sky, leaving a pale trail that faded slowly into blue. It struck me then how some things, honor, love, forgiveness, don't vanish when time moves on. They echo, and for the first time in years, the echo didn't hurt. It sang.